Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Thies, and it's really great to be with you. And thank you for joining us for our afternoon discussion on environmental justice and experiences of that related to sustainable freight, the movement of goods, and really actions and initiatives to advance and advocate for environmental justice. I direct the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability, and really honored to participate and facilitate this discussion this afternoon. We're really honored to have two guests who serve the community profoundly and really will really serve us as we have this conversation about their work and about how they experience these issues within the community. Jerilyn Lopez Mendoza is the Los Angeles regional organizer for the Climate Center, working to deliver speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions in California. In prior professional positions, she served as Deputy Director for Public Participation at the California Department of Toxic Substance Control, appointed by California Governor Edmund G. Brown, Commissioner of the Los Angeles Board of Public Works, and Vice President of the Los Angeles Board of Harbor Commissioners. Ms. Mendoza's tenure as Harbor Commissioner at the Port of Los Angeles from 2005 to 2010 coincided with the development and implementation of the first ever in the world port-related Clean Air Action Plan, as well as the innovative Clean Truck Program. From 2014 to 2020, she served as an appointee of President Barack Obama to the Joint Public Advisory Committee to the Commission on Environmental Cooperation. This trinational body advises federal environmental agencies on environmental impacts affecting the continent of North America, related to the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Ms. Mendoza also worked as policy director and staff attorney at the Environmental Justice Project Office of the Environmental Defense Fund in Los Angeles for 9 years, where she helped pioneer the use of community benefits agreements to offset the negative community impacts of public and private development, and assisted in the launching of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust to increase open spaces in the urban core. A native of Montebello, Ms. Mendoza earned her bachelor's degree in American Studies from Stanford University with departmental honors, and twice won American Jurisprudence Awards, the highest grade in her class at UCLA School of Law. She lives in the San Fernando Valley with her eternally patient husband and teen daughter. And we're also honored to say that she is a professor of environmental law, policy, and ethics for the College of Business Administration's master's program in entrepreneurship and sustainable innovation. David Pettit is a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He litigates primarily air quality and climate change cases with a focus on serving the environmental justice communities in California. David is a 1975 graduate of the UCLA School of Law and a lifetime Dodger fan. One of his career highlights was being entrusted to hold Jerilyn Lopez Mendoza's baby when Jerilyn stood with Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa at a public event, which means they go way back, and we're honored to have both of them. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. And like we said, we'll be together for about an hour, and really the format will be maybe, a half hour, 40 minutes of conversation, and then just open it up to question and answer, which for those on the webinar, you could post in chat and we will bring those questions forward. But first, let's have a conversation with Jerilyn and with David. Maybe starting with Jerilyn, and then David, could you please just describe for us what is environmental justice? How would you define it? How would you see it? How would you ask us to think about it as we begin this conversation this afternoon? And the Zoom message.
Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful introduction. And I'm very happy to be here and talking with our participants. For me, environmental justice is defined as environmental degradation or environmental burdens that are disproportionately borne by people of color and low-income people. It's been proven over and over through studies, scientific studies, all over the country, that environmental degradation and undesirable land uses, such as hazardous waste facilities, trash dumps, oil refineries, any kind of undesirable land use tends to be located in areas that are populated by people of color, minorities, African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American groups, and or people of lower income. So we could talk about doing anthropological studies of how that came to be, which came first, the people of color and the poor folks who live near that undesirable land use, or the undesirable land use itself. But that doesn't change the fact of the matter is that those burdens are disproportionately borne by those populations. And that proposition, that fact, is encompassed by this term environmental justice.
Now I'm muted, apologies. Now, David? Yeah.
Another way, I agree with Jerilyn, and another way to look at this is if you get in your car and you drive around Los Angeles or take the train around, and you ask yourself, where is pollution the worst and who lives there? Your conclusion almost universally is going to be the people who live there are low-income people of color. And we can talk about why that is and the role that institutional racism had in that. But for today's purposes, what my definition of environmental justice is serving those communities that are the worst affected by, in my case, particularly air pollution and climate change, and understanding, or trying to understand the role that in particular race has in why those conditions are as they are and what we can do about them. And as Jerilyn said, there are lots of studies indicating that, you know, you can do like a multivariate analysis of what factors are most connected with living in a high pollution neighborhood. And study after study concludes that the most important factor is race. And so that's what we deal with. That's what I deal with every day in my litigations, including, you know, with the Port of LA, out in the warehouse district, east of here, and elsewhere in California.
So, so if I could ask just your observations or thinking about some of the ethical pieces of that, and then we can then talk about the legal dimensions and legal initiatives. Because when you speak about burdens and the inequitable burden placed on communities of color or low income people, this points to this idea of benefits and burdens from an ethical way of thinking about justice, that benefits should be equally shared, burdens should be equally or proportionately distributed. And so what I'm hearing you describe is that a piece of environmental justice is dealing with the reality of the inequitable distribution of burdens. And so I wonder if that's accurate, and then if from kind of an ethical justice kind of perspective, if there's any other pieces of environmental justice that you would highlight as we first think about environmental justice and ethics.
Well, you raise a very interesting point, the issue of who benefits and who is burdened by environmental decision-making. And I'll give a different example that has to do with transportation. About 20 years ago, when the idea first emerged to modernize or expand Los Angeles International Airport, there was a large environmental review conducted to determine what the impacts would be on people living closest to the airport. And what we found was that after reviewing the study, most of the folks who would be negatively impacted by airport operations, particularly noise and air pollution, were African American and Latino populations that lived in Inglewood and the unincorporated part of LA County, an area called Lenox. However, one of the other things we determined was that over half of the international flights, as a for example, that leave out of LAX originated in Orange County. And so there was a very strong imbalance there in terms of who benefited from the international services at LAX and who was burdened by the operation of international travel at LAX. So one of the ideas that was floated at the time was to take over an old naval operation that had lots of space in near Irvine, to build a new airport there so that the benefits and burdens would be more equitably distributed. And that was very strongly fought by some very wealthy interests in Orange County who were not interested in building an airport anywhere near their area. So the fact remains now that, again, people who benefit from the access to international travel facilities at LAX, over 50% of that population is based in Orange County, but the folks who are negatively impacted by those operations are people who live close by LAX, predominantly African-American and Latino folks. So that's an example right there of where the operation of international services at LAX is very unequitably distributed in terms of who benefits and who is burdened. And that's a clear example of environmental injustice at work.
Thank you. David, thoughts?
Look at the ethical issue in a couple of ways. One is the freight business, in particular by using diesel equipment, makes people sick with the diesel emissions, but doesn't pay for it. So that's, if you're studying economics, that's a negative externality. And so and that's not the way free markets are supposed to work, but it's how this market works. And the people who wind up paying, if anyone, for the health problems is us, the taxpayer, who are picking up the tab, and we are subsidizing the dirty freight business. And I think that's wrong. And that's not how society ought to work. There's a principle in the environmental world, the polluter pays, which I think we would all probably agree is fair. That's not happening here. And that's part of my job, is to try to make it happen. Another way, it's as Jerilyn was saying about the airport, most of the people who, for example, live near the ports, live along the truck routes, they go out to the warehouses in, east of here, and live around the warehouses, are not benefiting from that traffic. They're getting sick from it, but they're not getting the jobs. They're not buying the 80-inch flat screen TVs and stuff that are being imported from China, put in warehouses, and then put on trains and sent to the Middle East. And at least part of the reason for that is where the environmental communities are situated, where they live. And to get back to something I mentioned earlier, a lot of that is due to zoning. And if you look at the history of zoning in California, for many years, it was overtly racist. And I'm not talking about just, realtors talking to each other. I'm talking about legal restrictions on who can live where on the basis of race. And if you look at the history of zoning for a while, it just jumps out at you until, fairly recently. The house I live in Santa Monica was built in 1939, and it is deed restricted against Blacks and Jews, meaning it's written in the deed that the house can't be sold to a Black person or a Jew. That's illegal now, which is, I'm Jewish, so I don't care anyhow. But that's how it was. And this is Santa Monica, one of the supposedly most liberal communities in the California, that up until the late 60s, you could enforce that covenant in my neighborhood against selling my house to me. And that's part of what we're dealing with when you look at who's living near these freight routes. And to me, that's hugely unethical to have a system that works like that, and we need to fight it.
In both the legacy issues that have formed this and then the current impact, as we're going to be talking about. One final question, maybe related to this part of it, is environmental justice is a legal framework, and it is And there's a series of laws and public policies, et cetera, related to environmental justice. I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about that from that perspective. And also, what I've read related to that is another dimension of environmental justice is the importance of giving meaningful voice to the people who would be burdened to have a voice into the decision making. And I'm wondering if that's a piece that that we might, if that's true, and if you could speak a little bit about that as well.
I just want to point out two quick things, and then I'll hand it over to David, who's much more versed on this issue. I found that actually there is a lack of law protecting poor and burdened populations from environmental degradation. So for example, the key law in California that's used to protect the environment is the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA for short. CEQA has no provision in it that requires an analysis of environmental justice impacts. It's something that's done sometimes, but there's no requirement there. And if you look at the federal level, there have been some recent changes, but for a long time, the only federal requirement relating to environmental justice was an executive order that President Clinton put in place in, I believe, 1994. So I found, at least from my experience working on environmental justice very closely in the early 90s, there was a severe lack of legal protections as it related to environmental justice and the folks who are burdened by poor land use decision making. But David, I'll leave it to you because this is something you're doing every day.
Well, that's unfortunately still pretty much true. There was a bill in the legislature this term, California legislature, to expressly require EJ analysis in the context of CEQA, as you mentioned, didn't go anywhere. It's, you know, the business community and the building trades hate it, and they're very powerful in Sacramento. And so we're still pretty much where we are when you were talking about that. On the federal side, as you say, there's an executive order which is widely ignored in practice, or just given lip service in the environmental documents. There's a portion of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, that has to do with discrimination in federal projects or projects receiving federal money or approval based on things like race or class. But the Supreme Court about 20 years ago held that to prove a case like that, you have to show intentional discrimination. It's not enough to show in de facto discrimination, that, well, it's a pattern that all the poor people live here and the rich people live somewhere else. You have to show that a decision maker intended that to be so, which is practically impossible. You're never going to find the email that says, oh yeah, let's hose these, blank group of people. So that really took that off the table. There are some federal administrative remedies under Title VI, but they're very slow and generally ineffective. So the idea of using what lawyers think of as equal protection law, or CEQA or NEPA, to deal with the environmental justice issues explicitly in projects it's a very difficult one to pull off. And my view is that the EJ groups can often do better by political means and community outreach than by talking to lawyers. And just to finish up, Jeff, in terms of your remark about the community voice, under CEQA, as Jerilyn knows, Jerilyn was a harbor commissioner for many years, back when the Harbor Commission had guts, if I may say so. And she sat through many meetings where community people, spoke up, and then it made a difference. But in most of the CEQA hearings I go to, sure, you put in your chit, and then, or now, you do it electronically and you get your 2 minutes or something. And then in general, the decision makers ignore you. So yeah, there's rules for community participation, but whether that participation does any good or changes any minds, in my experience, that's a very slim proposition that community groups aren't listened to unless they have lawyers and they're a credible threat to sue.
So thank you. So could you both speak about your organizations and what your organization's mission and purpose is, and what your work is, and kind of how that is a part of what how your organization engages these questions?
Go ahead, David.
Well, let's see. NRDC was founded in 1970. And I think in the beginning, it was pretty much, kind of a plain vanilla, environment. It was modeled legally on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, but concerned itself mostly with sort of federal, statutory issues, and really was not, in my opinion, either community, had a community consciousness, or much less any sort of racial or EJ approach at all. In this attitude, not just by NRDC, but by a lot of the big greens, caused a lot of people to get mad. And there was this meeting in 1990, Jerilyn? I'm talking about the Hemes principles, 1992. Anyhow, yeah, around that time period, where a bunch of civil rights and EJ groups got together with the big greens, and out of that came a joint statement everyone calls the Hemes, JEMEZ principles, that commit the green groups, including us, to being sensitive to environmental justice and racial justice in their work. So the extent to which that's true, I think, varies a lot. But we do now in NRDC, we have an EJ program that's dedicated totally to environmental justice work, headed up by a friend of Jerilyn's and mine, Melissa Lynn Perella. I'm not in that, but the litigation that I do, as Jeff said in my intro, is largely focused on EJ issues, and that's because that's what I came here to do. It's not, required in any sense of me to do that. We are struggling within NRDC to implement the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And equity, to me, speaks exactly to the environmental justice communities and their issues. And my hope is that we can focus, all of us as a group, on that as our first job. But that's going to take some time.
One quick question before asking Jerilyn. Could you describe the big greens for our listeners? Yeah,
there's a few large environmental groups that litigate. There's us, there's Sierra Club, there's Earth Justice. Did you work for, no, you work for
EDF.
EDF, right. There's EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. Sorry, my mind blanked a little there. There's a couple of smaller ones. SELC, I think that's Southern Environmental Law Center. They're excellent work, but they focus sort of on the Southeast and the Gulf. Those are really the biggies. I think, there's lots of small regional organizations, but most of them don't do much, if any, litigating. Earth Justice in recent years has taken a real turn towards serving the EJ community deliberately, which I think is a really good thing. NRDC, despite my, kicking them in the butt now and then, hasn't gone that far. So that's something that I'm trying to work on. But the big greens are the ones who get, have $100, $200 million in yearly funding, lots of members, can talk to Congress, they pick up the phone, can talk to state legislatures, and so have some street cred, not only in court, but in the legislative bodies as well.
A question was posted if PIRG is a big green.
No, I don't think so. Jerilyn may disagree. Public Interest Research Group, I think their scope is wider than environmental work. And I have never litigated with them. I'm not aware that they litigate.
Thank you. And Jerilyn, your organization?
So I'll tell two stories. My current organization, the Climate Center, is specifically focused on climate work and figuring out how to move faster to address climate change impacts in California. We're small. We're based in Northern California. We have about 20 staff members statewide. I'm the only one in Southern California. And climate justice and how the climate impacts are disproportionately affecting poor people and people of color in terms of the heat, extreme heat, wildfires, and things like that is definitely part of our agenda. But the work I was doing around the port was as a commissioner, and it was derived from the work that I was doing at that time, which was running an environmental justice project office as policy director for one of the big green organizations nationally, Environmental Defense Fund. And I was there for 9 years. When I left, the office shut down and has never been reconstituted anywhere else in the country. So the 10 or so years that the Environmental Defense Fund had an environmental justice project office in Los Angeles was the only time that Environmental Defense Fund had an environmental justice focus in a particular geographic area, in this case, metropolitan Los Angeles. So the work that I was doing on behalf of EDF was very much in partnership and in coalition with other organizations, faith-based groups, youth-based organizations, other environmental groups, environmental justice groups, housing groups, unions. It was very much coalition-based and community-based in terms of what our priorities were. Hence the reason why I got involved with working on the modernization of Los Angeles International Airport, such that the people who would be burdened would not only see the burdens, but perhaps see some of the benefits, such as job training programs that would specifically derive from the modernization plans, and building green space where on abandoned properties in low income areas that didn't have access to safe parks and safe places to play. So that was the work that I was doing when Mayor Villaraigosa at the time appointed me to be on the Harbor Commission. So it was from that environmental justice focus and the work that I was doing in coalition with other organizations that he asked me to be on the commission and bring all that experience to bear.
Thank you. I wonder if we might now begin talking about the ports and specifically the transportation infrastructure and the dynamics of community impact and community response to the question of logistics impact. And Jerilyn, you have something you wanted to share with us.
Yes, I did. I do. I wanted to give folks a little bit of context in the form of a map. So the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has a tool called Cal EnviroScreen. And I believe it's that link to this tool is going to be put into your chat so you can see this tool and use it for yourself. But essentially they have divided up by census tract all the different environmental burdens that are experienced by different census tracts throughout the state of California. And I wanted to use this to show a little bit of where we're talking about when we talk about the Port of Los Angeles. This is the Los Angeles metropolitan area, or LA County. To the east here is what's called colloquially the Inland Empire, San Bernardino and Riverside counties. Here, immediately south and adjacent to the ocean is Orange County going into San Diego County, and north we have Ventura County. So if we zoom in a little bit, you'll notice almost immediately there are some gray areas. Those gray areas are public uses. So for example, here's Los Angeles International Airport, El Segundo. LMU would be located immediately north of LAX in this area that's green, which is good, meaning that it scores low with respect to environmental burdens. But if you go and follow the 110 freeway all the way south to where it ends, you get this gray area, which is the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the port complex. And you'll notice that the areas immediately adjacent to the port are red, which means that they have the highest scores of environmental burdens based on their proximity to the port, as well as oil refineries and other undesirable land uses. So scrolling in a bit more, it looks like one big port complex here. But what you'll notice as we scroll in even closer, there actually is two ports at play here. That is this dividing line here in the middle. And on the right, you have the Long Beach port on the Long Beach Harbor. And then on the left, you have the Los Angeles port and Los Angeles Harbor. What a lot of folks don't understand is that the two ports, although they are immediately adjacent to each other, they actually are run by the two different cities, and each city has its own harbor commission that is chosen by city government. They are, in both places, they are appointed by the mayor and then approved by the city council. But in Los Angeles, people can be easily removed from the harbor commission, whereas in Long Beach, they tend to stay for their full 5-year terms. I just wanted to point out that these red areas immediately adjacent to the ports, both to the west in San Pedro and to the north in an area called Wilmington, are bright red. And what that means is that they score the highest with respect to the environmental burdens that they sustain. So if we take one example from one census tract in Wilmington, it was 96% Latino. I don't know what the other 4% constituted, but it was 96% Latino or Hispanic or Latinx or whatever term you want to use. It was in the 100 percentile, meaning it was the highest with respect to exposure to diesel emissions. Diesel emissions are a known carcinogen in the state of California under the California Resource Board's determination. So when you're breathing in diesel exhaust, you're actually exposed to a carcinogen that can cause all different types of problems. In addition to the cancer risk, it can also cause respiratory issues, asthma, COPD, any number of health issues that have been documented through medical journals, many of them through USC. It also was found to be in the 97th percentile for toxic exposures, some of which could be seen as the diesel emissions I mentioned, or it could be other different emissions that are considered to be toxic that are the folks who live north of the port are disproportionately exposed to. So I just wanted to give you a little snapshot of where we're talking about and who is being most negatively impacted by the port operations. So you can see pretty closely that this is all the gray area is all port operations. It's a pretty large area. And in to the north, again, there's Wilmington. To the west, there's San Pedro. To the east, there's West Long Beach. And all of those areas, as you can see, are bright red and in the highest percentile with respect to the pollution burdens that they sustain based on port operations. So hopefully that's helpful for folks as we begin a conversation about the logistics industry and port operations and the environmental burdens that are placed on the people who live nearby, as well as the workers. I want to underscore that. Workers and people who are working on the docks, the longshore workers, the members of ILWU, the International Longshore Workers Union, they are also exposed to all of the health hazards from port operations. So it's not just the folks who live nearby, but it's also the people who work there who are bearing these burdens of environmental exposure.
Thank you. David, anything that you would comment on or any observations?
Well, I'd like to give maybe 2 minutes on how the freight system works in LA and Long Beach so people can understand the level of exposure daily, 24/7, 365 that people in the communities that Jerilyn pointed out have to live with. So LA and Long Beach combined are the largest port in the US. and a very high percentage of all trade from Asia comes through those ports. So typically what happens is a container ship will head to Los Angeles, these huge container ships with, sometimes tens of thousands of containers on them, will come to LA. Right now, because of COVID and other issues, there's not enough dock space for them. So they're anchoring off the coast. There's somewhere, maybe you can see this from LMU, I don't know, on a clear day, but there can be 70 or more ships just, at anchor out there hanging around waiting to come in. Those ships are powered by diesel engines. And then when they sit at port, they are supposed to plug into electric power to run their ship equipment. Not all of them do. So that's another source of diesel emissions. When the containers are offloaded, most of them go onto diesel trucks, which then go either into the community or to the warehouse district, much of which is like an hour's drive east on a good day, east of Los Angeles. Some of the containers are put onto trains. Some, and this is really crazy, are put onto trucks that then drive a few miles to a rail yard, diesel truck, and then is put on a diesel train that will go, to the Midwest or St. Louis or Chicago or the like. There's also a lot of yard equipment that moves things around within the port. A lot of that is diesel. So, and the port works, 24/7, 365, and so do all of the transportation modalities. So it's the diesel exhaust from every method of transportation at or touching the ports that is the problem, the main problem. There's also issues with smog formation that the ports and the trucks contribute to, but for your everyday health problems, it's really diesel exhaust. They're tiny particles that you breathe in and they never come out, that are causing a tremendous amount of health issues, much more heavily in the EJ communities than in the rich white communities. I'll just close with one story. In an environmental document for a project that Jerilyn knows well, the SCIG Intermodal Project, which is proposed to be across the street from Wilmington, the environmental document admitted that the racial minorities will be disproportionately affected by pollution from the project, and they didn't care. They said that, and the Harbor Commission, which Jerilyn wasn't on then, said, hey, this is great with us, we're approving this project. We beat that in court, and now they're trying to build it again. So that's just, a day in my life, but this is what people who live on these freight routes have to contend with every day, every night, their whole lives.
And just parenthetically, a couple of years ago, the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability had a symposium on the impact of climate change in Southern California. And one of the presenters was from the city of Long Beach and their climate adaptation and action planning initiative, and spoke to the question of air quality and the impact on life expectancy, which within certain neighborhoods of Long Beach that had a greater discrepancy between that neighborhood in Long Beach and another than between the United States and Sub-Saharan Africa, was the data point that was shared at that symposium, which is another illustration, I think, of what you're pointing to. So could you speak about, number one, kind of your work and what are the initiatives and some of the specific projects or elements of litigation that you're involved in? And then if we could then also ask, what are the business issues that you see here? How is business engaging this? Are there examples of those trying to solve to this problem? Is it a question of not seeing the kind of responses that would be good to be seen? Those kinds of things. And then if we could then open it up to kind of question and answer. But first, your work and how you see your organizations and others engaging this, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the business piece.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about my work, which is historical, so to speak. I was on the Harbor Commission from 2005 to 2010, and it was an appointed volunteer position. So I was still working full-time at Environmental Defense Fund in the Environmental Justice Project office, full-time, while I was also doing the Harbor Commission work. And the thing I'm most proud of was at that time, the mayor instructed us that he wanted the port to be the cleanest and greenest port in the world. It is the largest in the country, along with Long Beach. The port complex together is the largest in the country. At the time, it was the 5th largest in the world. I don't think it's still that big compared to others in the world. But his charge to us was to make it the cleanest and greenest. And so we spent a year working with the Port of Long Beach commissioners and their leadership, developing what is called the Clean Air Action Plan. And that was designed to address all the different sources of emissions at the port that were deemed the most harmful to human health as it related to diesel emissions. So we're talking about ocean-going vessels, the huge ocean-going vessels that go back and forth to China and other places, the smaller harbor craft that service those ocean-going vessels, the diesel trucks that come to and from the port constantly, trains, and what's called dockside equipment, which is the equipment that's run by the different workers to unload the boxes, so to speak, from the ocean-going vessels and take them off the ocean-going vessels and put them on a train or on a truck. One of the people in the chat asked, why are all of these things so heavily dependent on diesel? Well, one of the reasons why diesel has been so popular, and diesel engines have been so popular for, you know, the 20th century primarily and into the 21st, is it's a very strong, reliable engine. It powers a lot of, it has a lot of power. And so the fuel that's used, the diesel fuel that's used in the diesel engines can provide a lot of power for a relatively inexpensive amount of money, the cost of the diesel fuel. And they last forever. I have seen a diesel engine that was over 100 years old still in use. So its longevity is very attractive. It's high horsepower and it's powerful engine, as well as the relatively inexpensive cost of diesel fuel. So that's part of the reason why all of these things are diesel based. So we implemented the Clean Air Action Plan in November of 2006, which had strategies in it to reduce emissions from all the sources that I mentioned: ocean-going vessels, harbor craft, trucks, trains, and dockside equipment. And it was the first of its kind in the world. It was a joint operation by the Port of LA and the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, because we didn't want to have it on one side and then have all the tenants just move over to the other side where they didn't have to worry about environmental improvements. It was also signed on to by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the state CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So we had a lot of support from the regulatory agencies, and we had a lot of stuff, good stuff in there. The goal of the Clean Air Action Plan was to reduce diesel emissions from port operations by 40% in 5 years. And we reached that goal, that reduction of diesel emissions, in 4 years, by 2010. So at that time, there was a lot of political will, both on the part of Los Angeles from Mayor Villaraigosa and from Bob Foster on the side of Port of Long Beach. And there was a lot of political will among the commissioners on both sides, people who had been appointed by those mayors on LA and on Long Beach side. And we sort of forced the staff at the two ports to implement the Clean Air Action Plan. And I think David can speak to more recent efforts that have been made to try to implement the second and third versions of the Clean Air Action Plan, and how that political will that we had in the early 2000s is missing. And as a result, the clean air that we were able to achieve at that time has either been lost or is gotten worse because those clean air action plans are not being implemented in the way that they need to. And then I can talk about the business aspect.
Okay, thank you. David?
Well, unfortunately, Jerilyn is right. With the current administration, the predominant emphasis at the ports is money. And you can say, I mean, Antonio had a lot of criticisms or suffered a lot. The one thing he didn't lack was guts. And he decided to do the right thing at the ports. Jerilyn was on board with that. And largely they did. That's different now. And what I hear when we propose something and maybe it'll be more expensive for a year or two, oh, we can't do that because then the shippers won't come here, they'll go somewhere else. It's called diversion. And they use that they at the ports use that to turn down pretty much any proposal that we throw at them. I've always thought that was pretty bogus, but what proved it was, as I mentioned earlier, the stack up of ships off the coast. You can go look today, and there's a lot of them out there. You know that if those ships had anywhere else to go, they'd go there. I mean, they're losing money every minute. They're sitting out there parked, and they're not, schlepping traffic back and forth to China. So I think the diversion argument is just empirically wrong, and there's just a lot of fear that people that throughput will go down, and people in the mayor's office will be blamed. Throughput is hitting records. I mean, I get these emails from both ports, records smashed, for this month's throughput. So the reality is there's tons of money in floating around in both of these ports, so to speak. And the answer, one of the questions in the chat was, will electrification deal with this? In general, yes, it will deal with that. And that's where we're trying to go. When we file lawsuits against the port, which, I have a couple now, if the judge says, well, what do you guys want? At the end of the day, what I want is for the diesel sources that Jerilyn and I have talked about to be electrified, and now for short haul, transportation, just, taking a box from the port to, I don't know, East LA or something to a store, the Sears store. There are electric trucks, short haul trucks now. You can go and buy them today that are available for that. Amazon just ordered 100,000, and they're not, unicorn trucks. They're real trucks that exist and Amazon's going to use. We could be doing that. We could be doing a lot more in terms of having the ships tie up to the dock than we are now. There are no long haul electric trucks now available. There will be, though, within a couple of years. There's a lot of companies working on those, but there's no commit by anybody to use those. And the economics, I'll just say this thing and then stop. The economics of diesel trucking is those trucks, nobody buys them new. The labor force is mostly, hardworking immigrants, don't have a lot of money. These are the folks driving the trucks. And so after a new diesel has put 1 million or 2 million miles in long haul across the country, somebody sells it to a port operator who's doing, 20, 30 miles per haul, and they're cheap. They're cheap to buy, and diesel fuel is, well, it's gotten more expensive, but it's it's readily available. And electric, people are afraid that with electric trucks, the upfront cost to get in will be huge. Even if the cost of ownership over 20 years will be lower, you still got to come up with the dough to get into one of those trucks, and that could be troublesome. So that's kind of the reality, the economic reality that we're dealing with this whole transportation system. But ideally, yes, once all the cars and trucks are electric, these pollution problems will go away.
Thank you. Jerilyn, you were going to talk a little bit about some of the business dimensions and dynamics.
So there is this concern, as David mentioned, about diversion, that if we make environmental improvements and environmental commitments to clean the air or use technologies that are newer and less polluting, and those cost more, they will divert business to other ports. That's simply not true. The Los Angeles and Long Beach ports have such an advantage with respect to its built infrastructure, to its access to close by train yards, its proximity to the warehouses, as David mentioned, located primarily in the Inland Empire and Riverside and San Bernardino counties. There are infrastructure benefits to doing business at the ports of LA and Long Beach. So if diversion is a non-issue, how can businesses be more responsible? And one of the answers is through what's called container fees, which would mean that a certain fee would be imposed upon the container or the end user. So whoever the container fee is being moved on behalf of. And it could be anywhere from $10 to $300. At one point, the port was considering a $50 container fee and determined that, say if it was a container or a box containing shoes that were manufactured in China, it would add at most 3 pennies to the cost of a pair of shoes to have a container fee of $50. And if they are moving hundreds of thousands of containers and you have a $50 fee on each container, you could then funnel those funds into purchasing cleaner technology, cleaner equipment, and reduce the pollution burden on the people who live and work nearby. So it is a cost, but because it would be spread out among all the different businesses that utilize the ports, that use those containers, it would be equitably distributed, and it would give a permanent source of funding for creating new and cleaner technologies that the ports could then use, and also perhaps even sell to other ports around the world that are also looking at this issue. So I don't think businesses are going to go anywhere. I don't think they would leave if the cost of their product is increased by pennies on the dollar when it's actually in retail stores, especially if it means that they would be building goodwill and perhaps even creating new technologies with those funds that they were able to procure through something like a container fee.
Thank you. David, thoughts, observations about that or other business dimensions? So we're getting close to our time here, and I just wanted to ask one other question after that. But
no, I agree with Jerilyn as usual. We were asking for $100 container fee. I think the port of LA settled on 10, which is worse than a joke. And I think even that they've suspended ostensibly due to COVID, although as I mentioned, their business is better than ever.
If I could maybe ask if you're just final observation, again, we just have a couple of minutes, but Jerilyn, in your organization's website, it's reflected in a portion called your theory of change. And this idea that that community involvement mobilizes community action, which results both in public policy responses as well as business responses. I'm thinking on behalf of my students that are on this session. We looked at stakeholder theory, and there's a construct that we looked at called market stakeholders versus non-market stakeholders. Market stakeholders being those that have a financial relationship with the organization, but the impact and power and levers of impact that those community organizations and government and regulatory agencies and all of these have on the operation of the business. You're pointing a little bit to that. So I'm just wondering if we could wrap up, if you could just talk a bit about how you see the work of collaboration and or kind of moving these levers of power to generate change.
Well, personally, I think any business that does things like move goods through the ports of LA and Long Beach, that's a lot of businesses. And not just those that focus specifically on goods movement like logistics, but the end users like Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart and Target. If they had more robust community education and outreach programs to reach out to not just their marketing, not just the people who they're looking to be customers, but the people who might be impacted by their business operations, and they were to engage in conversations with those folks in a meaningful way, meaning not just having for photographs only event, but having a meaningful dialogue about what their business operations mean to people who live and work nearby ports. I think they would both learn a lot about how their business impacts, and it would make them more sensitive to the sometimes harmful effects of doing business. So it would open their eyes a little bit, and it would make the people who are impacted by those decisions feel heard and feel that their life experiences that they go through every day with the toxic fumes and the noise and the diesel rumbles that go on all day and night, it would help them feel heard and help them feel like they're speaking to power in a way that is meaningful, in a way that helps them understand how the cost of doing business is a cost to their everyday lives. So having those dialogues and having there be some cross-education, I think would be really positive for all involved, because it would help raise the sensitivity level among those who are involved on the business side. And it would help raise the level of self-determination for the people who are living and working nearby, so that all could benefit from that kind of a dialogue. And as of right now, I don't think that such a dialogue exists.
It's siloed, fragmented, or not understood, or even people being made aware of.
Or it happens as a result of litigation. And that's how you get people to the table, is by having a litigation and forcing them to come to the table to talk about it.
And David, could you speak a little bit about that, the role of litigation in giving community voice?
Yeah, most of my cases are, in most of my cases, I represent community groups, mostly EJ groups. And these are groups that typically don't have access to, company CEOs or people high up in the organizations, the polluters, that is to say. So, I mean, before suing people, we always talk. We always say, look, we have these problems. You guys want to come to the table? Can we work something out? Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. And, we just get told to pound sand and then we sue them. And then at some point in a lawsuit, I mean, people always come to the table and we try to work stuff out. I think that this may seem odd coming from me. I spent my lifetime litigating, but I think in these cases, often litigating is a very inefficient way to deal with the underlying problems. It'd be much better if an industry-wide change could be brought about, and that's probably not going to happen through individual court cases, maybe through something that the state does or something that the feds do that would cover all ports and will, take away the uneven playing field argument or the diversion argument. But, efforts have been made in both of those arenas and nothing important has happened.
So thank you so much, and thank you very much to both of you. We're closing in on the hour, and questions have been posted in chat as we've been having this dialogue, and I appreciate that. I guess I just end by saying, is there anything else that you would like to highlight for business students that you think, from your experiences and your perspective, would be important for business students and business professionals to think about or to understand? Huge, broad question, I appreciate, but just wanted to give the opportunity.
I think business people have more power than they know. And I think having a strong sense of ethics, having a strong sense of what role they play in the community, both positive and negative, is something that LMU tries to instill in their students. And I think it's very important for them to understand that what an important role they play as employers, as leaders in the community, and perhaps those who are maybe having a detrimental impact because of how their goods and services are getting to them. And so to be mindful of those impacts is very important, and to think about sort of the holistic impact of their business operations so that they can come out on the good side of business as opposed to being the unethical side.
Thank you, David.
Jerilyn is so right about the power. You know, if Walmart and Home Depot and Lowe's went to the ports this afternoon and said, we're not going to order any shipments unless they're on the cleanest trucks on the market, it would change overnight because they have so much power. And that would be more effective, I think, than all the lawsuits that I could bring. So yes, the business community has tremendous power to do the right thing.
Well, thank you so very much. And I'd like to, on behalf of the CSJ Center and the annual symposium, the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability, and the College of Business Administration, thank you so much for this hour of dialogue and understanding. One of the things that I think gets lost a lot are two things just to highlight. One is the broad scope and scale of just how big LA is. And in population, in impact, in scope, it's just so dramatic. And really understanding that is so very important. And another thing, Jerilyn, you spoke to, but again, just to reinforce, to really always engage the full humanity of everyone. Those who are exercising business, those who are exercising public policy, our community members and our sisters and brothers, to really understand the human dimension and the humanity, and then the human impact is so vitally important. And so you've emphasized that along with really talking about the imperatives of environmental justice and the important work to be done to advance that. So thank you so very much. I see some contact information is being posted in the chat, which I really appreciate, along with some words of appreciation. And so thank you so very much. It's been absolutely wonderful, and we won't take any more of your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Great
Thank
honor.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jeff. Bye, everyone.